How's it going, fam? It's PewDiePie here, and today we're going to be talking about some more tech related stuff. So if you're into that, if you've been enjoying that content recently, the camera's pointed a little bit too low, but that's okay, it'll be fine. If you're into that kind of shit, then watch this video. Also, if you're into video editing, more specifically, I'm going to be talking about how you can sort of start doing some on-the-go video editing with a very budget but very high-performing laptop, in the sense, well, it performs well in like Adobe Premiere Pro and stuff because it can use CUDA acceleration, which makes a world of fucking difference. And you can typically find this thing used on eBay or Amazon for roughly 500 bucks, and with a couple very cheap improvements or upgrades, one of which is actually optional, but I would say you don't want to go without. With those few little upgrades, you can have this thing turn it into a fantastic on-the-go video editing machine. Typically, you know, editing in 1080p. Higher than that, you're gonna want a bit beefier and a bit more memory, but regardless of that, this thing is fantastic for what I do. So I just wanted to show this off. But of course, before I go into a ton of detail, I have to make a quick modification, because for some fucking reason, when I bought this laptop about 2.5 years ago, I thought it was a good idea to stick an Elgato gaming sticker on it. And believe it or not, that the adhesive on that motherfucker is fucking absurd. So let's start with getting that shit gone. Dunzo. Alright, so it's now actually the day after I shot that first part, because for some reason, when I went back to actually edit the footage, there was some really weird static in the audio recording. So hopefully that doesn't happen this time. But regardless of that, I'm just gonna really quick dive into some of the more in-depth specifics about this laptop, my experiences using it over, you know, the past couple of years, and more recently with video editing and stuff like that, since I've kind of tried to, as I mentioned, bring it up to more of spec as of the past couple months anyways. So we're just gonna go dive into that briefly. Now, of course, as I mentioned, this thing runs typically about $500 used on eBay or Amazon, depending on your preference. You can find it sometimes for less, sometimes for a little bit more, depending on the specific model. These are all technically classified as Lenovo Y510Ps, but there are several variants of it. Some that include dual graphics cards, some that include dual drives, like dual 2.5-inch drives, some that use the GT750 versus the GT755, stuff like that. Little things that can not really affect performance a ton, but sort of do affect the price significantly depending, especially since now if you want to go and buy the Ultra Bay components of this to say swap in a second GPU on a single GPU model of this laptop, that GPU expansion bay is legitimately $500 plus on eBay, when the thing was typically around $200 when it launched. So if you want that SLI thing, I would just buy it outright with the laptop in general, because if you're trying to do that after the fact, it is definitely not worth it. Now, okay, I'm just going to go break down these specs real quick just so you can get an idea of what you're working with. It's a bit dated, but for my use, it works fantastically. So here we go. Let's get right into it. This thing is packing an i7 4700MQ, clocking in the base clock, or the technical maximum frequency, is 2.4 gigahertz, but typically if the thing isn't thermal throttling, it'll be sitting around 3.4 gigahertz. Typically when video editing, except for the final render, it will be sitting at that 3.4 gigahertz. Gaming, it does throttle as well, because the combined heat of the CPU ramping up and the GPU typically does throttle it, but I don't see a ton of performance impact because of the CPU. Most of the gaming performance limitations are limited to the weaker GPU, which only clocks in somewhere around 760 megahertz. So if you're going for a laptop on a budget for gaming, this is definitely not it. Now, of course, the point of this video, though, is not to find a budget gaming laptop. There are many other options out there, and quite frankly, if you want, you can actually go with like a dual-core hyper-threaded i5 or something like that, and then something with a more powerful GPU, and you will have a much better experience in the gaming realm of things. But the 4-core 8-threaded i7 in this thing definitely benefits video editing and production and all that sort of stuff, and it definitely helps in all multi-threaded applications and whatnot. So I've got that paired up with 16 gigabytes of RAM. Typically this thing would ship with 8 gigabytes, but I did end up going out and swapping out the two 4 gig DIMMs for two 8 gig DIMMs, which ran me total about $80. I was able to get a pack of two 8 gig DIMMs from Crucial initially for about that like $80-$85 at Micro Center. Now, unfortunately, this won't be an experience probably most of you would have to deal with, but one of those DIMMs ended up failing after a day, so I ended up having to go back out and buy another one. Yeah, I guess if I had actually saved the fucking receipt, I could probably have got it swapped out. Yeah, that's my fault, so like, don't do what I do. But anyways, now I have two fully functional sticks in this thing running at 1600 megahertz, so you know, full 16 gigs of RAM, which is typically ample for 1080p video editing in Premiere. I know they technically recommend 32 gigabytes, but I haven't seen any sort of slowdowns because of this. Typically, if I'm monitoring RAM usage in Task Manager while I'm editing, it doesn't go above like 8 gigs of RAM used. Now, of course, it does ramp up a bit during the final render, so I guess perhaps your render times could benefit from having a bit more memory. But again, I haven't seen a massive improvement on my end from using systems that do have 32 plus gigs of RAM versus ones that have 16. Of course, if you're using very high bitrate footage or higher than 1080p, that is something to consider though. Then, of course, as I mentioned previously, this one is paired with a GT755M, so that's the slightly faster version of the GT750M with 2 gigs of VRAM, and ultimately, while that thing is capable of light gaming at typically sub 1080 resolution, what I really like having it for is the CUDA acceleration in Adobe Premiere, because that makes a fucking world of difference in render times. It can cut hour-long renders down to 20 minutes or sub 20 minutes, depending on how complex the project is, and that is no exception on this laptop. Anyone who's worked with Premiere for any sort of extended period of time knows that having any GPU, any form of CUDA acceleration, so I guess any Nvidia GPU, is better than having no GPU at all. And even with my 8-core 16-threaded Ryzen chip, the differences between using CUDA acceleration and just software acceleration are a world of difference. Rendering a 4K 10-minute video on my Ryzen chip just using software acceleration can be an hour plus, whereas rendering that same 4K video using CUDA acceleration, just switching that one thing on, can cut it down to around 25 minutes. So of course, while I'm not saying go and edit 4K video on this laptop, because that's definitely not what its strong suit is, it's definitely something to consider, because obviously it cuts down render time significantly on this chip. Now, granted, I have noticed, due to the fact that this is a slightly lower end chip and it is a bit older, it does still typically 100% out the CPU, but again, having the GPU there to sort of compensate definitely helps. Now, typically this one also ships with a small 24 gig SSD and a 1 terabyte 5400 RPM hard drive. The SSD serves as cache, sort of like how Intel's new Optane memory does, but that's it's the same concept, but I'm not saying that this is as good as the Optane memory, because it's fucking not. And quite frankly, I ended up removing that little drive and just swapping in my own 128 gig SSD from SanDisk, and just loaded a lot of my, like, obviously my operating system and a lot of my frequently used applications on there, since obviously having that faster boot and all that stuff makes a fucking world of difference. And the 5400 RPM hard drive that this thing ships with is really fucking slow. Granted, despite the fact that this laptop is, you know, probably 5 years old now at this point, I still haven't run into any issues with that drive. It's not throwing any errors. It still works fine. It typically hovers around 100 megs a second read write, so seems like it's okay. But obviously, if you're loading everything onto that drive, while it is possible, it's not exactly the best experience. So if you do get one that has like the disk drive or whatever in the Ultra Bay, as they call it, as Lenovo calls it, that's the swappable thing where you can put in like GPUs, a disk drive, or in my case, an extra hard drive bay, which is what I opted to do. You can find the empty hard drive bays on eBay for typically around $20 or less, at least at the time that I bought it. So that is definitely an upgrade to consider. Of course, you could also just open it up and swap it out with like a 1 terabyte, 2.5 inch solid state drive, and that would be perfectly fine too. But considering that I don't really have the budget to be throwing that sort of shit around, I just opted for the smaller SSD, and I'm still using that hard drive for like mass storage where I put footage and stuff like that. Now, of course, the screen looks fantastic. It's plenty of real estate for editing and stuff like that. It's a 1920 by 1080 model. There is a 1366 by 768 model as well, so just bear that in mind while you're shopping for one. Colors look fantastic. It's not like crazy oversaturated. Viewing angles are pretty good. The speakers on board are okay. They're honestly, they're better than, like, I would say your average laptop speakers, but they're not mind-blowing by any sense. One thing I will mention is the touchpad is fucking terrible. So if you're not going to be having an external mouse, then perhaps look elsewhere, because the touchpad on here, it's not great. One thing I do like about this one is the 15.6 inch model. There's also a 14 inch model, but that one is made with the model number Y510P, I believe. This keyboard is full, like it's a full-size keyboard. It's got the full numpad and all of that, which is one of the things that drew me towards this one versus that 14-inch model. The 14-inch model is slightly cheaper, and typically that 14-inch model also is the one that has the 1366 by 768 screen resolution. But, you know, it feels pretty good. It's nice to type on, and, you know, there's no real problems with the keyboards. I can't really complain. It's got a nice red backlight, all that stuff, so, you know, you pop that out in a fucking Starbucks and they're like, people look at it and be like, oh my god, you're so cool. Now, one issue, and this would probably be my biggest complaint, is the battery life. Now, granted, I'm not exactly expecting to get crazy good performance off of a higher performance laptop from the battery, because it's like, typically when I'm using this thing anyways, I'm gonna have it plugged into the wall. And another thing to mention is that if you're on battery, there's no way in hell you can use the dedicated GPU. It will just switch over to the integrated graphics, and that will obviously see a massive performance decrease in games. And obviously you can no longer use CUDA acceleration and stuff like that. But again, if you're typically sitting for long periods of time editing video, you're probably going to be sitting somewhere where you have access to a power outlet. But regardless of that, that is something to keep in mind. Another thing that I like about this laptop is the sort of form factor. It's a bit on the heavy side, but it's also not one of those massive, bulky, like Republic of Gamers laptops. It's a fair bit thinner than that and a fair bit lighter, but it also isn't nearly as thin or light as something like a Razer Blade or the MSI Stealth series, so just keep that in mind. And of course, thermals aren't fantastic due to this thinner form factor. It does throttle pretty quickly if you're 100%ing all cores, but as I mentioned previously, that doesn't seem to have a massive impact in performance in gaming, and renders aren't hurt a ton by that 1000 megahertz decrease when the boost clock turns off. And the thing typically hovers around 85 degrees Celsius while rendering and stuff like that, so it's hot, but honestly not that hot as far as laptops are concerned, because typically you're gonna find that it's pretty much impossible to find a high performance laptop where that chip doesn't sit like really close to its highest rated temperature. Perhaps I could open this thing up, disassemble it completely, reapply thermal paste, all that stuff, and see if that would improve thermal performance. But at the moment, I'm just like a little bit nervous that I'd forget to how to put it back together. So, and I don't really want to break it, because I could no way in hell afford to replace it. And of course, back on the topic of that CPU, as you saw previously while I was showing me messing around with it and trying to be professional looking and get B-roll. It scores around 534 in Cinebench. I have gotten higher scores than that in the past, even with it thermal throttling. I was getting like a little bit over 600 before the Windows 10 Creator update, so just something to keep in mind perhaps as more updates are pushed out for Windows 10 that might affect that, because on previous versions of Windows 10 I was getting a higher score in Cinebench. Not sure if that's related or if there's something else at play here, but it does typically hover between 5 and 600 CB in Cinebench. Anyways guys, I'm gonna wrap this shit up right here. If you are considering purchasing this laptop or just want to look at it, there is also a newer model, but then again, it's not really a budget sort of oriented thing anymore at this point. It's the Lenovo Y500, which I typically have seen still in stores, despite the fact that it is running a bit more dated hardware. And it looks a little bit different from this one. It looks pretty cool. It's not the laptop that I would go for if I had to pick one right now. There is a newer model if you're looking for something slightly newer than this. This one typically goes used for around $500 used on eBay. So if you're looking to buy one of these, I'll probably try and drop a link in the description to like a search result or something so you can find exactly what I'm talking about in this video. Again, it's the Lenovo Y510P, the 15.6 inch model. The one I have is with a 755M, and of course I've upgraded it from 8 to 16 gigs of RAM and swapped out the disk drive for another 2.5 inch drive bay. That's one of the things that I really love about this laptop, and I wish more manufacturers would do something like this. Even though it is proprietary, that Ultra Bay design is only something that Lenovo makes. The fact that you actually have the option to swap in and out stuff like that is really fantastic, and even though it's kind of impractical in the long run, I do wish I would see more manufacturers doing something like this. But that about sums it up for this video. If you liked this video, be sure to slap a like on it. If you want to see more tech stuff, slap a like on it. And of course, if this is the first video you've seen, go ahead and drop a subscription or whatever. I know that I haven't, like, most of my videos aren't like tech related, but I've been kind of trying to change that because this is like my big fucking hobby. Look at this disgusting piece of machinery behind me. It's just something I'm constantly fucking around with. I've got a lot of cool ideas and stuff that I would like to make videos on in the future. One in particular right now is, you know, comparing budget SSDs to something that's higher end, since I've got a couple of Samsung 850 EVO drives sitting around, and some of them are, just kidding, none of them are sitting around. I'm actually using all of them, but benchmarking those two against each other to see what are you actually getting when you spend like $100+ on a drive that, or $100 more, I should say, compared to something like a budget drive from SanDisk, since you can typically get like a 128 gig SanDisk SSD for like $40 fucking, and that's cheap as hell. But anyways, that's an idea for another day. So thank you very much for watching this here video. Hopefully the audio isn't super fucked up this time, because I don't want to have to record this video a third time. And hopefully, you know, hopefully you learned something, hopefully you enjoyed. Maybe this has opened your eyes to, like, maybe buying older hardware isn't such a terrible thing, at least on the mobile market. Thanks again for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.